Now let's bring in Rami Khouri, who's the Director of Global Engagement and a Senior Public Policy Fellow at the American University of Beirut. He joins us via Skype from New York. Hopefully your line will stay stable this time. Now, listen, I wanted to ask you about where this puts the Biden administration and its future relations, say, with Iran. Does this complicate the task for Biden in how to deal with Iran, the fact that this situation is being resolved?
I don't think so. I think it probably is a positive element. The Arab countries in the Arab region and the ones in the Gulf and the GCC don't have a unified position on Iran. Some of them want to use forceful sanctions and threats and put military options on the table. Other ones want to have quiet diplomacy. But reducing the tensions between the GCC countries and Qatar will definitely be a positive step. And the question of Iran is going to depend much more on what people decide in Washington and maybe a little bit in Israel, because Israel drives a lot of Washington policy on this. That's going to be the determining factor. But Qatar and Kuwait and Oman have good relations with Iran, trading. They talk, they're in contact all the time, and that's a very positive thing. The genesis of this conflict between the blockade, because it's not really a two-way conflict, but the genesis was the Saudis and the Emiratis were terrified after the Arab uprisings of 2010, 2011 about trends in the region. Democracy, voting, leaders being thrown out, open media like Jazeera and others. But they were also worried about the United States starting to negotiate with Iran and the U.S. pulling out of the region. So having a sensible, logical, political dialogue between Iran and the Arab countries is the only way to do this. And you've had some Saudis and Emiratis and others behind the scenes talking to Iranians. So we'll have to wait and see. There's also a new factor here, which is some countries possibly, without naming any because we don't know, this is speculation, but some Arab countries may feel that their links with Israel may give them more comfort in terms of dealing with Iran. If the U.S. is slowly downgrading its role in the region, which it may or may not be, but the links with Israel are also a new factor that we have to put into this situation. But the real driver of this whole boycott issue was the United Arab Emirates, Mohammed bin Zayed, the crown prince and effective ruler of the UAE, rather than the Saudis. The Bahrainis and the Egyptians went along with it because they basically gained a lot of material things and a sense of sort of a role in the region. But the Saudis are much more sensitive to the damage that has been done to their reputation because of this, because of the blockade, because of the war in Yemen, because of the internal factors that they've dealt with in terms of repression. So the Saudis are much more sensitive to international opinion. The Emiratis are much more forceful and decisive. And we don't know the relationship between them right now. It seems to be evolving. And we haven't heard anything about the Emiratis opening their border or doing anything. So we have to really wait to get more information about what is the result of this reconciliation or reduction in tension, opening of some borders. But it's a positive move. Everybody should welcome it. And people should not repeat such foolhardy unilateral blockades that are based on political differences that translate into acts of almost irrational political violence.
Now, Tommy, you mentioned there that in passing the normalisation of relations between some Gulf countries with Israel. Give us an idea of whether this actually, some of that might be tied to this, and in what way?
Well, it might be. The Emiratis have established normal relations, and some of them are enthusiastic about economic ties. Of course, we don't know what the Emirati people feel about this. The likelihood is not all Emiratis are happy with this. We know that around the entire Arab region, somewhere around 70 to 80% of the population of the Arab countries don't want to normalize with Israel until Israel has a fair peace with the Palestinians. Then everybody's willing to normalize. The Arab Peace Plan is based on normal relations with Israel, which came out of Saudi Arabia and the Arab Summit years ago. But we don't know what average people around the region think. The normalization is a logistical, mutually beneficial agreement between individual leaders in Bahrain, in the UAE, in Morocco, Sudan, even the whole government isn't behind the normalization or the steps towards normalization. The military side wants to do it, the political side in Sudan doesn't. So these are very delicate, limited depth logistical arrangements rather than peace breaking out or anything like that. The interesting thing here also is the announcement for this came out of Kuwait, not out of Washington, as far as I can tell, though things may have changed in the last 15 minutes. The United States wants to play this up as a big deal, and Jared Kushner is trying to take a lot of credit for it. The likelihood is that the Omanis and the Kuwaitis did most of the heavy lifting in terms of discussions and how to get this resolved. But again, we just have to wait for the details. These things are not completely clear, right? The details are not completely clear right now. And this may be a limited but significant first step towards reducing the tensions and eventually getting back to normal relations. But normal relations, as your correspondent said, mean that different Gulf countries have different policies. They're different in their economic weight, their ideology, the nature of their leadership, their relationship to open societies and closed societies. They're very, very different from each other. They've never had a strong, unified position on anything political, really. And even when they did, say, on Palestine, they just broke it because they thought they had things to benefit. So it has never been a major political bloc, but it has been a functioning technical collaboration among these six like-minded countries, which started at a moment in the 1970s when I'm old enough to remember when it started, and it was very much seen as a Arab rich person's club to protect the wealth of the Arab Gulf region that suddenly boomeranged or mushroomed in the 70s when oil prices increased, and people saw the GCC as a way for the Gulf countries to kind of protect their wealth, and it never had any real political weight and has much less now. There's another danger here. The UAE and the Saudis, especially the UAE, may suffer what the Trump administration has suffered, which is a drop in trust internationally. People might say, well, I can't make a deal with this country because they'll just break it unilaterally, like Trump did with different, climate change and other things. And the Emiratis and Saudis just unilaterally broke the relations with Qatar, boycotted them, started the war in Yemen. And this kind of unilateral, impulsive, often violent behavior, whether it's military or just political violence, this is a problem for many countries because others will look twice before making agreements with them in the future.
Rami Khouri, thank you very much indeed for your analysis.